now going to move on to another series of presentations in a cluster where we're then going to have another short panel discussion and a Q&A. So this is, I guess this afternoon, I really wanted to look at, ideas of things happening in practice and what is the lived experience of those things happening in practice. And so we're going to turn to architecture this afternoon. It's going to be chaired by Joe Jack Williams. Now, Joe Jack, which I like to call you sometimes now, is the head of regenerative strategy at Bywater, embedding his years of cross-disciplinary experience directly into their projects and business. He is coordinating Bywater's core response to the climate crisis and approach to ESG. Prior to joining Bywater, Joe was a partner at leading architectural practice, Field & Clegg Bradley Studios, where he led on research and sustainability, working across projects to drive forward innovation and minimise their impacts on the planet. So it's a real pleasure to have everyone here with me today. So Joe, welcome. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. This is fantastic for me. I, last year, jumped to the other side of the table, so I'm now a client and a developer, so I spend my life talking about yield compression and IRRs and BIPs on NAVs and to rooms of people who wear watches that cost more than houses around here. So this is exciting. I absolutely love this, and it's really fantastic that Claire invited me to come along and chair and help sort of get all this amazing knowledge from the people who are going to be sharing it. So Rowland and Sam, Ben and Imad. So really exciting. I'm not going to talk too long. We're going to come back with some questions. So there will be some time for questions at the end. So do think difficult questions. It's way more fun if I can put Rowland on the spot. And we will have a bit of a discussion beforehand. So think of those questions, write them down as they come up so you don't forget. Because this is always much more fun. All of these kind of events are about learning and sharing, so it's really exciting. I'm going to introduce Rowland. He doesn't need much introduction, but I will. I'm going to try and make him blush before he comes up. Rowland's the Honorary Professor of UNESCO Earth and Architecture Chair. He's the CEO of Earth Building UK and Ireland, Ibuki, and Director of Round Earth Consulting CIC. I'm going to let him show all of his kind of amazing experience before we go to the speakers. So Rowland, if you want to come up.
Hi, everyone. It's a big topic with not that much time, and someone's going to count me out when I run out of time, yeah. So thinking about this conversation, I wanted just to start by saying that time has a big influence on the way that I think about these materials and what to do with them, because I built my first earth building age 22, and I'm now 62. And so this time has passed, and the way that I think about things has changed over that time. And in the first 5 years, or maybe 10 years, or perhaps 15 years, I was very self-conscious about the fact that I was using materials that are not permanent, they're impermanent. And the way that I could manipulate them was by the addition or subtraction of moisture. And anyone that comes after me and comes to those buildings can manipulate those materials again infinitely. And so over time, I've come to see that as being something really fantastic and interesting and fascinating and offering so many potentials. In the past, I thought about these materials purely in their ability to hold a roof up. And now I think about them as managing the internal air quality of a building. It's a completely different conversation to be had around the use of clay. And of course, clay isn't clay at all, because, you know, kaolin at one end is very, very different to bentonite at the other. And, you know, speakers this morning talking about recovering clay from different places and what can you do with it in a ceramics arena. They're very different kind of ways of thinking about things than what I've done in making materials for buildings. And and clay is this just unbelievably flexible medium. So this building is a nursery school built by H.G. Matthews, a factory where I work 2 days a week. And the blocks are not square; they're kind of to make a dome, and and it's a 5-meter dome. It stands on a foundation which doesn't have any concrete in it. It's just gravel compacted into a trench. And in 50 or 100 or 250 years, all of that material can be made into nice square blocks and make straight lines with corners, right? Because it's just an endless thing. And part of this conversation about clay, which isn't really a conversation at all because clay doesn't really exist, it's all of these different things, for me, is that this ability to change and rechange is something about electricity. It's about the electrons and how you're changing the electrons from positive to neutral states through the use of water, and then the removal of that water, changing them back into different states. And in that sense, I feel it's like us. It's a live material. It's a living material. It doesn't die. You can make something now and you can remake it in 1,000 years' time, and it will come back to life and do something else. And so, in that sense, the conversations this morning about material going to landfill, I don't really mind material going to landfill, right? Because it's always there. You can just go and dig it up again. But what I do mind is that when you fire it, you're killing it. Okay, you cannot any longer do anything with it but grind it down. That's literally it. And because humans operate at the scale that we operate, a lot of people know about sand, the problems that we've got with sand and sand extraction at this global scale. But no one really talks about clay in that way. But last year, China, I'm just choosing China because it's the biggest, right? Made 800 billion bricks. Right? It's 160 billion tons of clay that is no longer clay. And that's to me, that's a massive problem. That is a massive problem. So, now we go to policy, and we had some really interesting conversations about policy this morning. But I just thought I'd just put up a little thing. So this is the government site, which is the one for the laser. It is that very top one. No. Anyway. So this is the government site, and who is likely to be affected by an increase in landfill tax costs? And landfill tax, for me, is one of the very interesting instruments that the government's come up with, because it wasn't designed to help earth builders, and yet it sort of does, because developers now have to look at the amount of money that they're chucking into a hole. And from the government's point of view, who's likely to be affected by an increase in landfill tax? Operators of landfill sites. Really? I mean, they're just there to say, yeah, dump it over there, no? I mean, they get paid a little bit for it, sure. But really the people that are going to be affected by this are the people that have got all of this waste to take to landfill. And the government's sort of idea is not that. And they're not saying, or maybe we could encourage the people that have this waste to think about it differently. It's all implied. If we charge you more, then you'll think about it more, rather than we're going to charge you more to make you think about it more. So, the policy objective, they say, may include recycling, composting, and recovery. Well, that's a big area, right? Recovery, right there. For me, it's unimaginative. It should really talk a little bit more in detail about what those guys were talking about this morning. That you can take this material, you can process it in all these different ways, and you can get it to do different things without just going and chucking it into a hole. So now it's moved from £103 a tonne to £126 a tonne. And with the figures that was quoted this morning, 13, 45 and 60, was it? That's a lot of money. Right? It's just the biggest amount of money because it's in weight, and Earth weighs. And so this is really the area where people that are throwing things away really need to be paying a lot of attention, because you can throw away wood, but it's relatively light, But when you start throwing away clay, it's the big time. So there's a whole lot of unresolved stuff that hopefully I'll touch on a bit more. This is a site in Walthamstow, and this spoil heap here was the seed stock to party walls for a housing estate in this what had been a light industrial zone in Walthamstow. So it's crushed up buildings, bits of soil, and we sort of tested that, and we built some test walls and so on about making party walls in rammed earth. Then they had to take it all off site because there wasn't any room to now dig foundations. And then they started digging foundations. And as they started digging foundations, they discovered that they were really into clay. And this is a whole jumble of concrete and brick and steel and all sorts of stuff. But when they got into digging the hole, that was clay. What do we do with this? So we had a conversation, and I suggested that they could make it into blocks if they took it to H.G. Matthews, the factory where I work in Buckinghamshire, for 2 days a week. But I also had to go and talk to them and say, what do you think about using somebody else's clay in your production system? And that was like the green light. That's what Jim had been waiting for quite some time, because all of the other factories in that area, brick factories, have all gone out of business because they've run out of clay. Okay, so the problem for the developer is he doesn't want to make waste and take it to landfill, and the problem for the brick manufacturer is he's running out of clay. So that's a perfect, almost perfect. It's quite a good, sort of thing for the two sides. But it's more complicated because, as was noted, if this stuff is marked up as waste, then in order to take it at the factory, yes, we need the certificate that says it's got no nuclear waste or asbestos or whatever. But also we can only send it back. We can take it from that site as long as we send it back to that site and not to any other site. In order to send it to any other site, then we need to be a waste transfer station if we're dealing with waste. So you suddenly find yourself in a slightly sort of Kafkaesque world where you're talking to people about a crime that you're not quite sure what you committed, and no one can quite describe it to you, but nevertheless you're sort of in that space. So this is H.G. Matthews. This is a machine from the 1920s for making bricks, for moulding bricks, which they've repurposed for making blocks, which they call strocks, that get put onto pallets and wrapped up and sent off back to site again. And these particular ones I'll say more about. But in the housing, we said to them, you can finish this stuff in a lot of different ways. We've just had Clayfest. So I should just quickly divert and say that Ibuki, Earth Building UK and Ireland, is a membership organisation, is a charity. We do work with policy. We do work with research. We do a whole lot of different things, including that we are the partner organisation in the UK to the UNESCO Chair on Urban Architecture, and that's how we're starting to build a network group of universities working in this area: architecture, engineering, surveying, archaeology, art, all of these things that revolve around the area of these materials. Anyway, we just had Clayfest, and we said to these guys, you can plaster this, you can make different colours and different finishes. No, we just want blocks. And so that's what they got. And I thought that maybe that would be a bit contentious in the thing of a new passive housing development. But no one's really said anything about it. So my career's spent, quite a lot of my career has been spent digging holes. Most of what I do in the rammed earth side of things, which is where I come from, has been about site soils and using site soils and trying to separate things out. I believe this is a thing that happens and then it comes back. And it's the sorting of those soils at that moment which is so important. It's the really, really important thing, and one that we'd have to pay particular attention to, because once you've got everything jumbled up, you've just put a figure on it. You've just quadrupled the price of everything, of separating it all out, and of finding that all of those elements again that you can then recombine in interesting ways. When you've got them separated out, you can dry them out, you can crush them down, you can do all kinds of things with them. You can play around with the colors. You can make these are cylinders. So these ones at the front here have got crushed brick, and the ones top right are with crushed concrete. It's a different color palette. We're using site waste, site demolition spoil, as well as the clay from site. And I'm not going to go on about that because I think Emma will. But I'm going to go on to this, which is this site in King's Cross, which called the Tribeca site, where they are extracting a 6-metre basement of London clay, and we are taking that clay to the factory and converting it into blocks. Again, a very interesting process. We can take it to the factory. We have to bring it back here. We're probably using, if I was feeling optimistic, I'd say 3% of everything that came out of the hole will go back into the hole as a product. The rest is waste because we can't take it and send it to anywhere else. These are the issues that we're sort of grappling with in some way. And these blocks they're clay blocks. They have a little bit of straw in them. They are molded in a very old bit of kit and then dried. And then the subcontractor says, well, if I've got to lay them, it's something different. And so the cost is going to be, 50% more. Why? Well, because it's a bit different. So then, and so this, now you're in the wonderful world of contracting, subcontracting, okay? And everyone's managing their own risk profile and so on. So we brought them to the factory and had them build a piece of wall, and the engineer was there, the architect was there, we're all standing there. Took him about 3.5 minutes to realize that he was laying blocks with mortar. This is a clay mortar, not a cement mortar, and that actually it really wasn't that contentious. And so all the time one's having to sort of sensitize people to what we're asking them to do, because although it's very straightforward, it feels like something different. I've been a bit triggered, I have to say, this morning, because there's so many people standing up here, and this afternoon actually, because there's people standing up and saying, oh, we got all this clay from HS2. I've been to the HS2 site. We've asked for HS2 clay, and we'd like them, I'll sell you some. Okay, right. And we'd like them to make the downstairs toilets at this great new station with an unfired clay block. But apparently, that's too risky. So this is a complicated game that we're playing, and they can see that it's useful to them in some ways, and in other ways, when you get into talking about scale, suddenly it becomes more complex for them to think about. So this is the Tribeca site, and this is just the general clutter of a modern construction setup, and you've got to insert your material in here. The guys are then cutting the blocks, to fit their bonding pattern, and putting them the offcuts back into bulk bags, which go back onto the truck, that come back to the factory for the next delivery. And those cut blocks are then remixed and made into new blocks. So our circularity starts right at the beginning. And of course, it'll go right through to the end, because even if nothing else happens, that clay is the clay that came from that site, and it will just go back to being, well, it still is that clay on that site, right? So these are 6 meter high sections, and they are said to be non-load bearing, although they carry their own load. So you could build 2 stories with them without a problem, and with the following wind and an engineer that wasn't, you could go a little bit higher and you could do a little bit more. Okay, am I in time? There you go. Thank you very much. I've just got to say it again. Earth Building UK and Ireland is a membership organisation, and we seek collaborations and research, fundraising with other partners, and we do a lot in the area, and please do come and have a chat.
Not to plug it again, but Ibuki's great. It really is. Thank you, Rowland. That was fantastic. Every time I hear you speak, I learn something slightly new, which is great. I'm just sponging all these kind of things together. Next up, we've got Imad. Imad's going to be fantastic. I saw Rowland skip over a couple of slides, and Imad's already told me there's a couple of duplicates. I think they're well worth another look anyway, so it's going to be great. Imad's an associate architect at Tucky Design Studio, one of these fantastic designers that are doing great stuff, really innovative, really low carbon, sustainable work. There he champions the use of natural materials and how these can be interwoven into sustainable regeneration of buildings and landscapes. Most recently, he's led the studio's pioneering Rammed Earth house to completion, oversaw the retrofit of the Ackland Burley School, which I used to live nearby, so it's fantastic, really great, and is collaborating with the British Ceramics Biennale this summer. So here he is on that kind of note, so come on up and ask.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. For those of us that don't know us, we are Tucky Design Studio. We were formerly Jonathan Tucky Design. The practice was formed around 25 years ago by Jonathan, who actually didn't study architecture. He studied social anthropology. But as a practice, we've always been interested in existing buildings and how we can adapt them, reuse them, remold them. Jonathan's background in anthropology really meant that we were interested in places and people, not just built fabric. And part of that is because of the connections they have with the people, with the cities that we live in, and partly because actually retrofitting buildings is the most sustainable way to building. And as part of that, reclaimed materials really became ingrained in the way we work. And that means we start every project treating it as a kind of library or archive, as a memory of place. We try and take stock of every, or almost every, material in the project, see what we can reuse, and avoid taking it into landfill. And this image is quite a good example, quite a small example of that, about trying to find other uses for waste. So on this project, very small project in the middle of London, we had to strengthen an existing floor structure, and as part of that structural exercise, we had 2 redundant floor joists, and we, rather than chuck it into waste, we thought we could use it as a bench in the front entrance. So seeing the history of the house as soon as you walk in, and trying to deliver that in a kind of crafted way. So it's a sort of small detail, but it talks a lot about what we are as a practice. And this is a sort of very typical project of ours. This is called Cascina, or I think it just means farmhouse in Italian. and it was a sort of former agricultural building that we turned into a house and studio. And this was the studio. This used to be the hayloft. And I think I'd say a lot of our job is about trying to convince people to do something that they're not comfortable with doing. And in this particular case, it was the structural engineer again. And in this case, a structure like this in the UK would really be protected, but there was no protection at all on this kind of building in this part of Italy. And we got to site and we thought we would absolutely retain the stonework, we'd retain the structure. The structural engineer came in thinking that he would rebuild everything. We fought for that, and eventually came up with a strategy where we retained all of the existing sort of timber work with a very slim, slender secondary structure, which could then express everything that was old about the building. And then on the same project, as a practice, we very, very much enjoy learning about local and traditional forms of construction. And in this particular floor, we used coccio pesto, which is a mix of lime mortar, sand, and any kind of terracotta. On this project, we had to take off a lot of roof tiles, and we crushed that up and recycled it into this floor material. And this tends to be one of the easiest way we get reclaimed materials into a project. And you can also vary the size and the mix of this material, so you can get quite smooth floors, and you can get quite sort of heavy aggregate floors. This is a project we have on the drawing board at the moment, which I think Rowland has consulted on as well. And it's a natural winery in Sussex. It's a growing building type in the south of England today. And this was another agricultural barn, a prefabricated concrete barn. So we came to site, we saw what we could retain, what we couldn't. So we're going to take off all of the asbestos roofing. We're going to keep the prefabricated frame. And as an agricultural site, they have quite an abundance of straw and quite an abundance of clay. And we're talking with H.E. Matthews about sending some of that to them to then remake into these strocks in the middle of this pod here. So as part of that winery, they're going to need offices, they're going to need tasting rooms. So we're going to make a sort of structure out of these strocks. We're going to take off the concrete panels, make them bases for those strock blocks, and then crush them up and make them into paving or hardcore for groundwork as well. This is another project we've got on site at the moment. This was a house built in the 2000s, made to look like an old Wealden Hall house with an old green oak frame. As a green oak frame, it sort of moves a lot, so we came to the house and we found it very leaky, it moved a lot. It had paper-thin insulation in the walls and absolutely nothing in the floor. And this was one of the recent projects where we've started to include the category of waste in our contractor selection, and it's paid dividends, I think, because we asked them about their approach to waste, and they have our specification, and they're kind of empowered to give us suggestions for what they think is an opportunity on the site, and repeat that again when we start on site. So on this again, a very small example, but as part of the structural works, the oak frame had moved a lot, so we had lots of cracks. And we had to reinforce it with this simple bow tie joint. And it was actually the site manager that suggested we could use some of the bracing members that had been taken out to then put back into the building. So that was one of the small moments where everyone's speaking together, and the site managers and the contractors, knowing the ethos of the project, can contribute to the sort of final thing. And it's a little bit about what Victor said about planting a seed. And letting it grow. On the same project, as part of our floor works, we had to take up the entire floor, and rather than treating that as a disaster, we treated that as an opportunity. So we had quite worn out, tired looking terracotta tiles, and we had really, really nice timber floorboards. And there's a furniture maker that we've always wanted to work with, and in a conversation with him, we found out that 20 years ago, his dad had built the house. And another form of circularity. And he was really up for making these floorboards into kitchen fronts. So we did. And then as part of the other flooring, we crushed out that terracotta, we crushed out the granite worktops, we crushed out porcelain tiles, and made it into terrazzo. The company that we're working with on the terrazzo, I haven't fact checked this, but they pride themselves on being the most sustainable terrazzo company in the country, because they use their binder that they use is less than 1% Portland cement, and that movement is sort of growing in the terrazzo world. But in both these cases, in the timber floor and the terrazzo floor, it's a very nice sort of feeling. It's a nice, interesting second or third life of a material that speaks to the history of the house and recalls what once used to be there. Which brings me neatly onto the rammed earth house. So the project came to us about 5 or 6 years ago from a client who was really, really interested in our sort of environmental impact. And at the time, we were increasingly developing an interest in natural materials. So we've worked in rammed earth, but we've also looked at hempcrete, straw, cork, and we'd been trying to use rammed earth for a while. And this is now complete, and we think it's the first house of its type built purely out of rammed earth in the country, but Rowland might fact check that. The site is located in Wiltshire. It's on top of a Kimmeridge clay formation, and the site used to be a brickyard. So we knew that there was a history of drawing material from the site. And there was a sort of handful of buildings remaining. There was a Victorian cottage and there was an old brick shed. This is a slide by BC Materials, which we often refer to in the project, and it talks about the circularity and the cradle to grave system of clay in construction. And the brief from the client was to build them an unconventional but contemporary country house that was grounded in environmental sustainability. And initially they thought that they wanted to demolish and rebuild, but as a practice we'd never really done that before, so we wanted to find opportunities not to do that. And we looked at the site context, and rammed earth really made sense for us, making use of the rich clay in the ground and reusing the construction waste like the brick and the concrete on a sort of 90s extension that was built with sort of quite poor quality cavity wall construction. And we were guided by experts like Rowland Keable and Martin Rauch in Europe along the way. Martin, for example, calls the process 100% earth. And by that he means there's a distinction between unstabilized rammed earth and stabilized rammed earth. Stabilized rammed earth is often called shoncrete, SH concrete. Unstabilized rammed earth is using sort of no lime stabilizers or cement. It's designed to sort of wash away and erode over time, so it's about controlling that. But the actual process is quite simple. You use clay, you use aggregate, and you mix water, and you can make walls. And it's a centuries-old building technique. Most people associate it with sort of warmer climates, but the tradition of building in earth has been there for a very, very long time. And on this project, it was a first for the builders that we worked with, so we had to find ways to simplify it. And at the start of the project, when we were being guided by Martin's team, who have a sort of factory in Austria, they'd send us recipes with quantities like 21.7% clay, 23.2% brick, 22.1% concrete, and it was impossible to follow on site. Until someone came to site and just said, why don't you just use a bucket of this, a bucket of that, a bucket of this, and a bucket of that? And the light bulb suddenly sort of flicked on everyone. And that meant that the whole process was then repeatable. Oops. So that slide you'll probably remember from the previous presentation. The the clay, we started extracting material much before we started on site. I'd say probably 6 or 7 months before, whilst we were still designing, and we'd done a few mock-ups at that time as well. So clay we took from the ground. We took as long as possible to dry it, so we put them under these canopies, and then when it was ready to be crushed, we crushed it. The aggregate, that's the Victorian cottage that I mentioned. So the scar off the building that you can see is where we took or partially took down the 90s extension that was made from cavity wall. We very, very carefully extracted the brick, extracted the concrete, and that's 2 people there for scale. And separated it as well. It was important that the brick and the concrete was separate. As we went along site, we found that the brick, when crushed, would really just disintegrate, and it wouldn't sort of bind to the clay. So as a result, we had to add 25% limestone gravel from a local quarry. So that's why it's not 100% earth on this project. It's about 75% local site one material. The rest had to be brought in. And then the whole site was turned into a sort of part quarry, part workshop, with builders doing everything from extracting the brick, extracting the clay, crushing the brick, crushing the aggregate, mixing it, making the formwork. And pretty much everything was a new process because they'd not really been used to doing it in such a way. And we found people with a stonemasonry or ceramics background were much better than concrete and bricklaying. And the whole thing, by the builders being involved in everything, it gives the building a very handmade quality. The process of actually ramming the wall was you put up 2 layers of formwork, you moisten the sort of mix that you've just made, put it in the formwork, and then you ram it, sometimes either with a tamper or by hand. And slightly different to concrete, you have to take off the formwork as soon as the top layer is done. It doesn't, rather than curing, you have to let it dry, and that usually takes around 4 to 6 weeks. And then unstabilized rammed earth is designed to erode. The surface of the wall needs some protection, so you raise it off the floor, you put a capping on it. Sometimes this is a very, very large overhang, or sometimes you can put these erosion checks in. And they're called erosion checks because the wall is allowed to erode, and these sort of horizontal layers check how much erosion has happened over time. The principle is that water flowing down the surface of the wall washes out the finer grained clay particles. The higher the speed, the greater the erosion. And these layers of lime mortar or tiles or any harder material channels the water away and reduces the erosion. Over time, those larger pieces of aggregate embedded in the wall become sort of prominent. The surface hardens over time, and erosion never really stops, but it really, really slows down. And the picture from the left to the right is an example of when the wall is freshly sort of struck, and about a year after that, when it's had some erosion. The photos are taken in the winter on the right-hand side, so the colour of the wall is very much wet looking. But I would say the idea of patina and weathering is something we look at as a practice quite a lot, and it's something that we have to explain to clients as a positive thing rather than a negative thing about how a building should look different in day 100 and 1000 rather than it being exactly the same as day 1. So this is the completed building on the right hand side. You see all of the detailing is about controlling water runoff. Martin Rauch often says nature is the artist, and that's something that often got quoted back to us by the client. So every 4 to 6 layers, you'll have these sort of harder layers of erosion checks, and they're doubled up or quadrupled up at corners where you get a lot more weathering. They act like coins that you see in rendered buildings. And then in addition to that, you've got deep window reveals. You've got stone sills with curbs, and a lot of these details were developed as we did the mock-up at the early stages. And I'd say that that idea didn't stop at the rammed earth. It was a building that was really designed in a way that looked at water through the site. And a tutor of mine at Bath called it tectonic determinism, which was architecture that's shaped primarily by its tectonic quality in the way that it's put together and made. And this detail, again, a small one, but it was a detail where we wanted to test designing for disassembly. So this is a timber to stone joint, sort of inspired by traditional joinery, traditional Japanese joinery, and it has no cement, no glue, no nails. It's just compression fitted, and then you hammer in these two wedges on each side. And over time, when those wedges loosen, you just hammer them back in. And that's not how we built the entire house. So I'm not gonna be under illusions of that. But it was it's right at the entrance to the house. So we enjoyed doing that one, and the joiner that we worked with, or the timber framer that we worked with, he told us that we couldn't do that detail in green oak because green oak moves. So he actually suggested using reclaimed green heart, which was recovered from a pier in Devon, I think. And that was a really, really hard wood, and it allowed us to do this detail. So it's another use for an old material as well in there. And then the internal walls of the house, the mix is very different. It doesn't have any erosion checks, very, very tight layers. So you control the dusting, and it almost shimmers. And it can be retouched forever. I think Rowland said that you add moisture and you can just change it anytime you want, and that's exactly the joy of this material. It's a lot like pottery rather than construction in some places. And this is a moment in the house and sort of encapsulates a lot of what the project is. This is an all rammed earth detail, so a rammed earth lintel over the window, a rammed earth sill, and rammed earth reveals. And you can see the old bits of the building there. You can see the brick chips. You can see the concrete whiteness. And all the horizontal surfaces, you can also polish to bring that out, and you can make floors out of it. The floors are exactly the same mix. It still has the old bits of the building. You can vary the color of it. So in the middle image, it's quite dark, but it's a different room in the house, and we just added some charcoal, which gives you a very, very deep kind of black rammed earth floor, and you can also have underfloor heating in it. And one of our early references in the project that we sent to the clients was the book In Praise of Shadows, and in there they talk about, or they refer to the principle of wabi-sabi, which is admitting or embracing imperfection. And this rammed earth floor, we were told that it is going to crack. Don't try and not make it crack. And the clients embraced that straight away, to the point where she was interested in filling the cracks with something else. But eventually we accepted that some of these changes, like the walls eroding, like the floors cracking, were just part of the house. On the right-hand side is not a rammed earth floor, it's a timber terrazzo floor, which again is about taking timber waste and making it into an upcycled product. I think this is the last slide on the house. Sorry. So internally, we finished it with clay as well. So the big white walls you can see there are clay plaster. We were quite keen to keep with the same material palette, and they're just unfired, breathable clays. Mixed with minerals and pigments, and it's not just good for the external environment, it's also good for the internal environment in regulating that air quality that was mentioned earlier. And that story of where the building came from was apparent to us both inside and outside. So On the right-hand side, you can see the new building next to the old, with the sort of bit of the old that we took away to make the new. So that conversation and dialogue was always important for us. Which brings us to Stoke. I think Sarah's going to talk about this later, so I won't dwell on it too much. But this is a project we collaborated on with BCB, who are ultimately all about clay, all about doing very, very sustainable, wonderful, community-led things with clay. This image shows two different types of clay, one from HS construction spore from HS2, and the other was surplus clay from biennials past. The BCB team came to us to see what we could transform this into. And we transformed this into a playscape, led by Sarah from BCB, with some support from a few of us. And the brief was to make a temporary playscape which could become a prototype for a permanent playscape in Stoke. The project started actually with university students sketching up ideas to do with play and what memories they had as kids. And a lot of that related to being in a sand pit, climbing, jumping, and we took those ideas and made a sort of plan for doing this in Round Earth. And it was the opportunities that came up during the site as well were the company that supplied the aggregate actually are a local company that were paid by local construction sites to take the aggregate and sell it back to them as aggregate. And that links slightly to the localness of using material from near site, but also then we reference history by having these blue tiles that reference the city's history. And it was made by lots of hands. No two tiles are the same. And I just want to finish on this slide. Sarah told me that this was her favourite bit of the playscape that we made, and it's fragments of bits that were found in the kilns of the potteries, fragments of history embedded into the built fabric, which speaks about the memory of the city, the layers of the material that speak to the collective effort of everyone to make that a reality. And it sort of encapsulates what's special about Round Earth. It speaks about something that's very, very handmade, that's very crafted, that's sort of sensitive to the environment, but also traditional and contemporary at the same time. Thank you.
Jonathan Tuckey is somebody I've been looking up to for years, so it's fantastic to see it still carrying on, still doing amazing stuff. And I had no idea he wasn't originally an architect, so that's amazing. Next up, we've got Ben. So Ben's going to give another great talk. So Ben's a designer, researcher, builder, and co-founder of Local Work Studio. Again, another one of these companies that I've been looking at for the past few years, thinking they're great. How can I work with them? Still not done it, but Ben maybe soon. He's committed to applying circular economy principles and knowledge of material reuse and invention to any project. He's got a background of building repair, which I think is really interesting. You know, that kind of arts and crafts kind of approach of how you build stuff. He was educated at the RCA, so he has this kind of design approach as well, which I think is really interesting. You know, again, balancing across all these different boundaries. He continues to research and innovate within a specialist field, developing new architectural landscape-led design projects, working with existing buildings, local materials, waste, crafts, and people. I think it's going to be a really interesting talk. So thanks, Ben. Come on up.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I started off in ceramics as well, prior to going into conservation work. I studied ceramics in Falmouth in Cornwall in 1995. I started that. And it was a really good basis for kind of my future work in a way, and our future work, because the first kind of year we were just let loose into the landscape to gather clay, to gather mine waste, and to test and try and make ceramic materials from that. And it was just really a kind of amazing learning journey to go on. After graduating from college, I wanted to get into architecture. I've always been into architecture. I've always enjoyed architectural ceramics, brickwork. So I joined a local brick company in Sussex, and I was lucky enough to be given the opportunity to manage a terracotta workshop in Brighton, making architectural terracotta for restoration throughout the UK and Europe. And that was kind of my first introduction to using waste, which has really just stuck with me for the rest of my working life, really. This is an image for people who don't know, of a brick clamp. So we've been talking a lot today about how kind of clay moves from a site to somewhere else to get made. This is an amazing historic process where families or communities of brickmakers would travel around the country making bricks from the clay that came out of excavation and firing them on site with no kiln. So there's no kiln structure. The kiln is the bricks. There is fuel added to the clay and also kind of packed into the bricks as well. And some of these can be over 1 million bricks in quantity. And they're lit, they are self-burning, and you get these amazing, beautiful different colours and flashes depending on the oxygen kind of ratios in the kiln. Well, it's not a kiln, within the structure. And I was kind of blown away by this way of working. But also we had to, for one of our projects, try and match a historic terracotta body called Codestone. And I'd encourage people to look that up because it's got an amazing history. But it used, this was kind of like 18th century and early 19th century as well. But they added a kind of crushed glass material into the clay body, which did a number of things. It brought down the firing temperature, but it crucially made it really hard and gave it this kind of almost marble-like, but kind of Portland stone, beautiful surface. And there are examples of it still in the UK. It's outlasted a lot of Portland stone. I then started my own company doing building conservation in Cornwall and kind of moved away from fired clay into unfired clay. And I think I kind of really learnt how amazing it is that in the west kind of coast of the UK, so kind of Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, there's no limestone, so they didn't have lime. They had to import lime. It was very, very valuable to them. So they built in earth. They had solid cobbles down here. This is a repair to a cobble. Lots of daubs, lots of kind of these beautiful clay mortars. But it's also the wettest part of the UK. So kind of the wettest part of the UK was building in earth, and the drier, kind of hotter east of the UK was kind of using bricks and tiles and timber and stuff. So it just felt like a real mismatch. It was like, wow, you can do that. You can build with clay in this really damp environment. But it's because it regulates the moisture. It was beneficial in those really damp places. Yeah. So I did that building conservation company from kind of 2005 till 2017. And then myself and Loretta, my partner, started Local Work Studio in 2017. That is a black and white photo, but it's actually 2017. It's not historic. But we're based in Sussex. We're a very rural kind of location on a farm down here. And I've kind of skewed the map because we're in clay country. This is Wealdon Clay, and there's an Ibstock brick factory. You can see top left up there. And that's actually, I think, the last place in the UK that's still doing clamp firing, which is interesting. And they got some lovely bricks as well. So I put this slide in because it kind of reminds me to talk about several things. It reminds me to talk about the ingenuity of working with clay and how you can do it with simple tools. This is a kind of illegal BMX track near where we live, built by kids over the course of like 10 to 15 years. And the landowner recently kind of found it and was like, what the fuck is this? But they've now gone into this amazing kind of agreement between the landowner. He was so impressed with these kids, who are not kids now. You can see the guy on the left is not a kid. But he was so impressed that they've now got a kind of signed waiver that this is all good. But it kind of also makes me want to talk about vernacular landscapes, which is something we're interested in. but also how you can work seasonally. So when you work with clay, you're working with soft materials in the landscape or in architecture. Historically it was seasonal work. And we're kind of, in a way, I guess, all of us who are working with clay in architecture are trying now to fit it into a non-seasonal kind of homogeneous kind of annual activity to fit with modern construction. But I think part of what we do, we're quite interested in kind of, again, trying to work seasonally because it kind of allows you to use waste. It allows you to use seasonal materials, maybe sweet chestnut timber, lime, clay, all these things. So I'm interested in kind of developing that again. But yeah, in the winter, these bike jumps are covered to stop erosion. But then they're just kind of like reworked again in the summer, as kind of Rowland was saying, that it's a live material. So there's an old saying about winning the clay, and this is what happens, isn't it? What does that mean? 10 minutes? I don't know what it means. Okay. That's good because I've only just started. So winning the clay is this kind of, when you go to a building site, if you found clay, it was like, yes, we're gonna build now. And we've worked quite a bit in East London. This is in Crayford, and we developed a way of working influenced by an organisation called Rowland in Brussels, where you do an audit. You do what we call a pre-deconstruction audit of a site. It's kind of commonplace now to do that. And you're mapping materials that you have, and you're mapping kind of layers of opportunity to access those materials. So maybe there's kind of like some repairs to a gas main, they're going to dig up the road, you can get some stuff. Maybe there's going to be some piling, like core drilling to get the clay. So kind of when you start to map and overlay, you can see that there are possibilities to gain materials. When you have construction, you have excavation. It's kind of a given. This is a kind of, obviously, a historic drawing of them kind of digging canals in Ghent for drainage. And these are kind of, few slides are just the initiation of a project that was then taken over by BC Materials and Ken, who's going to talk today, developing a brick, unfired brick, for an extension to his design museum in Belgium. This kind of material, when we were brought into the project, we were looking at excavation material. It looks generic. It's kind of silt. It's like this kind of classification silt material. But once you start to kind of wash it and sieve it and analyze it a bit more, you can see it's kind of like archaeology, really. You're starting to look at man-made materials. You can notice glass, brick, etc. And this is just a kind of quite simple way of analysing what you have to work with. Can this form a mortar? Is there a sufficient binder in this kind of finer material on the right-hand side to glue stuff together? What's it made of? We also work a lot in landscape, and I think, alongside architecture, working in landscape allows you to work at scale. It allows you to work with huge volumes of material. So this is a project in South London that we jointly won with Assemble Architects as part of a competition. It's a kind of very unloved park with this horrible kind of mugger cage, lots of resin-bound gravel, kind of all sorts of nasty stuff. But we've done lots of kind of community engagement. Again, kind of working with clay is brilliant for that. We've done quite a few kind of brick-making workshops as part of co-design for various projects. It's always kind of a right laugh, and you can work with all ages of people. But through the co-design work, we kind of came up with this plan for kind of two halves to the park. One is kind of very play-orientated, and the second is there's a lot more nature in the South Park. But the materials that we're making is this self-bound gravel path material, which is essentially kind of rammed earth, basically, but in the landscape. So you're dealing with very kind of like basic raw materials. We're using construction waste, we're using clay, we're using some quarry waste as well. And it's just about how you roll it, how you compress it, and how damp it is. But you can form these lovely paths, which again are kind of live, like we're talking about with rammed earth. They can be continually repaired and maintained. I think repair and maintenance is really big for us. mostly because it allows you to use soft materials, but also it involves people. So if you kind of come up against a client who asks for like a maintenance-free building or landscape or feature, then you're dealing with concrete and steel, you're dealing with plastic, kind of the worst offenders. But if you allow maintenance in, you're allowing people into the project, you can include training. It's just a much better system, I think. So yeah, through these kind of like raw waste materials, we're developing lots of landscape paths. We're working with Tom Stewart Smith at the Tate Britain at the moment on a new front landscape. And again, we're doing this self-bound gravel. And we've done some kind of little trial prototypes, but we're using cockle shell to form these bound gravels. And it's really kind of, it's interesting talking about the shape of aggregates. Like, it was great listening to the soil talk this morning. I get very passionate about aggregates as well. And the kind of the shape of these shells, the cockle shell, this kind of curved shape, especially when it's broken, is interlocking and forms a really tight, lovely surface, very, very strong material. And yesterday, I was kind of overseeing the collection of 40 tonnes of it from a Thames fishery for the Tate. But yeah, this kind of self-bound gravel, these are our prototypes for testing for compressive strength. Again, it's the same language as rammed earth, but this is a landscape material. We've worked a lot with chalk because we're in the southeast of the UK and there's lots of chalk. This is a project from a couple of years ago. It's a lovely material. It's a very soft limestone, but it is self-binding as well. You can use it like a rammed earth. But we used it to make plasters, internal plasters, when combined with a really lovely kind of greeny kind of clay from at the foot of the hill of the project. This is our roller pan mixer. We've talked a little bit about machinery in terms of the filter presses and stuff, but I really recommend roller pan mixers. If anyone's into machinery, we were very lucky to get a grant that gave us the money to buy this machine, but yeah, it crushes and mixes at the same time and is brilliant for making these plasters. So this is just a sample. So the left-hand side was a backing coat, and then this is the clay chalk top coat in 2 different finishes. And I want to move on to kind of like the bigger picture in terms of what we're interested in now really is kind of how excavation can also enable habitat creation, possibly, within a project. So we did it's a project again with Assemble Architects, but in Devon. And it was, it's a farm in between Dartmoor and Exmoor. It's kind of quite high ground, quite boggy. But it's been used for kind of standard agriculture for a long time. And the client bought it to rewild the site, and they immediately released beavers, as is what happens now. And one of them escaped, I think, but they got them back. But they made ponds, they made habitat, and they kind of did some really crazy stuff as well in terms of making habitat. They kind of tried in a quite anarchic way to imagine how like a herd of mammoths would move through a landscape and the damage that they would do. But this kind of like, this randomness is great for nature, and these kind of like, even just forming a scrape in the ground just enables kind of population and habitation, sort of new habitat for all different types of species to come in. But it's nice kind of this is obviously happens really only in a rural setting, but to kind of, when you're collecting clay for a project, to then leave a pond. It's a very simple technique. You obviously need the luxury of land to do it. But it talks of kind of historically, you would see it. You'd see a manor house with a lake. You'd see a kind of Victorian brick-walled garden with a pond next to it. So it's very kind of like clear visual narrative of the material came from here and now it's built this. But to leave these kind of, to leave habitat is great. This was just the project kind of ongoing. So we developed a range of clay plasters, low carbon concrete floors, and then kind of plant-based stains for larch timber on the outside of the building. So this is with rye flour and linseed oil. And then kind of there was one project in Denmark that we've been working on for a while where it all kind of came together. And again, this was a kind of rewilded agricultural farm. But it had been happening sort of slowly over the course of 20 years with the same client. But they had this amazing old school building on the site, which they wanted to turn into a kind of learning centre. And this was working with architects De Journes and Bell from Denmark, who are just amazing, really, really, really skilled, and with a basis in conservation as well, which meant we were kind of really talking the same language. But again, we did our kind of usual approach of an audit. What have they got on site to build with? But there's this beautiful deposit of glacial. It's a glacial deposit of clay, and that's kind of like that was kind of new to me, coming from somewhere where you have this, ancient, millennia-old clay deposit underneath you to kind of look at something which is way more recent, and it's kind of like nature's done the work. The glaciers moved over the landscape and ground the rock and kind of sorted it for you. And it's also not very clayey. It's quite short in ceramic language in terms of its more kind of silt-sized particles, which is great for building, great for turning into plasters. So again, there was this kind of like scraping the landscape, but then leaving it, not trying to kind of make it nice again. So they went in with machinery and they dug enough clay to do clay floors and internal clay plasters. But then they kind of fixed a trail cam on a tree and just watched what happened. And it became kind of like a little pond. They could film deer coming in, lots of different wildlife, and they're going to monitor it as part of a kind of bigger research project. So it's just been left as a scrape. We also kind of gathered this bulrush fibre, which is great for internal plaster. So mixing that with the clay, it's super fine. It works really well in a kind of thin top coat, fine plaster. And this is me working with the architect, Justine, kind of going through different colours. We used different kind of waste pigments in terms of roof tiles, again, from the previous project, kind of ground down, biochar to make the blacks and the greys. And this was all onto hempcrete walls. And then I went to train the kind of tradesmen, and that was a kind of initially uncomfortable situation where I'd come over from England to tell them how to plaster. But that kind of awkwardness only lasted probably about 10 minutes. And really we were all on board, and it's kind of, these skills are interchangeable. We do a lot of training ourselves. We train sort of young people. We train who are kind of going through construction school in kind of standard building trades in brickmaking and plastering, not brickmaking, bricklaying. But this is all transferable skill. If someone can plaster a wall with a gypsum plaster, they can plaster with clay plaster. And we're all talking the same language. It's very, very easy to do that. So yeah, lovely kind of internal clay plaster walls and clay floor. This was with horse manure mixed into the floor. So the plant fibre pre-digested, post-digested in the floor helped to stop it crack. And it's a really lovely velvety surface as well. And this is the clay plaster wall as well. But yeah, that's it.
Thanks. I mean, brilliant. Sorry, brother. I'm keeping you in the shade, which is not quite right, is it? We're going to have a quick discussion. Obviously, you've all been thinking of your tough questions. So you've still got another 10 minutes to write them down and formulate them into something nice and difficult. But I think for me, lots to learn about, lots to talk about. I think there's a couple of things that really come to mind. One, I think just the first thing to really talk about is site investigations. I think what's really interesting is all of you described a kind of process of sort of identifying abundance. And I don't think anybody's really doing that enough. I think probably 99% of the industry isn't really looking at it. And the analogy I heard is, instead of thinking about what do you fancy for dinner, it's about looking in your fridge. It's that kind of simplicity to it. And I think it's in some ways it sounds really simple. You look at the site and you find it, but I just wondered if any of you had any insights about actually how you go about it. What are we missing that the rest of the industry, within the rest of the industry, you know, when you look at your site, are you looking for certain aspects, or is it a kind of blank slate? How long does it take? How do I put it into a program? There's some really technical things in here that I think is probably what's needed in the industry to really underpin. I don't know, maybe Ben, do you want to go first, and we'll do it in reverse order?
Okay. Yeah, I think each project is so different. I mean, we've kind of done audits where we've been asked to audit everything, and it's overwhelming sometimes, especially in a kind of urban environment. Because if you kind of cast like a 1 kilometre radius from a site, you know, you're including a vast amount of information, and you need to really just focus on material-wise what you can get from the site, but then the skills you want to start mapping skills, you know, relatively close by as well, and thinking about kind of reducing material movements, thinking about who can process materials on-site and off-site. But I guess it's kind of, you've got to think about easy wins, and it's quite good to be, I think, kind of have a reduced palette or brief. So if someone says, you know, let's just focus on, can you make a plinth wall out of something for me? And then, you know, some internal plasters, and we'll think about other stuff, you know, maybe. And that kind of reduced brief does help. But it's kind of, I guess, the way to win it round that we found is through, because auditing is quite dry. It's quite a dry process. I find it really creative. I love doing it, but it's kind of quite hard to present to people, to a client, to get them excited. So really kind of the next stage on, the strategy and the making the samples and the prototypes is where you hook people in. And if you can make a beautiful sample of something, you know, it speaks a lot to people. So yeah, you've just got to be really forensic with the auditing. You've got to kind of really like spend a lot of time. You've got to have several people going through a building site. We did one in Lewis recently for Human Nature, the Phoenix development, which is kind of 1980s industrial state. So you've got to map the steel, and it turns out to be kilometres and kilometres of steel, and it's amazing. And you just hope that some of it gets through, and some of it will hook into the future project.
I think it's a staged approach for us. I think part of the reason people don't do site investigation is it costs money at stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and people are happy to wait until you get to site to find out all the problems. So I suppose a more prosaic answer for me is we have to convince clients that it's necessary to do them, otherwise you're going to end up in trouble later. So it's partly that. It's often we suggest stuff with existing buildings. You don't know all the information. If you've got a virgin site, then you can build anything you want in a way. But if you've inherited an existing building with gypsum plaster, clay plaster, lime plaster over it, there's so much stuff hidden in the walls that you don't know about. So it ends up being an easier question to answer to the clients. So as is the case with everything in construction, we have to answer it in the sort of time, cost, quality triangle. So we have to convince the clients that it's going to save them time later down the line. It's going to save them costs later down the line, and you're going to get a better result. So, and that tends to work.
So my initial background was 15 years mainly in Africa, where you're quite a long way along a dirt road, and the idea that we were auditing is rather sort of grand idea, but you're on a dirt road and somebody built that road and they've looked around at the material locally and they've used borrow pits and so on. There's always information. You've got to go a long way before you fall out of information, but you need to look at it, what is there, and you need to look at it creatively. And so I'm going to take this shameless opportunity to talk to you about our learning outcomes, because we wrote a full set of learning outcomes with a group of European organisations, a bit like ours. And they had to be robust in the sense that they had to make sense in Portugal and Slovakia, as well as France and Scotland. Okay, so you've got to really drill into what you've got and see what are the common things. So this is structured as knowledge, skills, and competence. And so it's a very kind of European framework. But in the unit B for building, the first line of knowledge is geological, geographical, and cultural issues affecting traditional and modern earth building techniques, right? Which basically covers the field, right? Now, this is level 3 and 4. So this is for autonomous workers on building sites. It's where most of the skills and knowledge lie. It's where Ben is, essentially. Okay, and then if you're an architect, you're level 7. Okay, so you probably need 10% of this because you're not actually out there on site. Except that maybe you need a little bit more than 10%, and so you'd start with this level 3 and 4, and that would be like a checklist of things to think about all the way through the process. This is the basis of our National Occupational Standard, and also of the occupational standard of the Czech Republic. So it's kind of growing this way of looking at information from the building side of things as opposed to the designing side of things. And this is what we're using in trying to work out a network of higher education organisations through the UNESCO chair.
I mean, incredibly thorough. I mean, it is really interesting, that kind of focus, as well as that kind of broad knowledge. And actually, I think you need broad knowledge to know where to focus. I think it's really interesting. Perhaps we'll open it up to the audience, actually, just looking at time. Anybody got any difficult questions? Again, really keen on the difficult questions. I think there's one up there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. My question is maybe for Emad and Ben, but I think both of you showed projects where you're quite collaborating with craftspeople or craftspeople's knowledge. And I guess my question is, for Emad, like, how much have you collaborated by getting your hands dirty on site? Is that what you're learning as an architect? And Ben, you know, where does that line lie for you as a kind of, I guess, craftsperson builder? I don't know.
So, as an architect, probably not as much as I should be. But my background, I spent 4 months on site, volunteering as sort of in between university years on site, building some social housing. And then I spent 2 months at Hook Park doing timber framing. So I think that's given me a basis of wanting to do that a lot more in practice. As a practice and a team, I think collaborating with craftspeople is one of the things we enjoy doing more than probably anything else. Particularly, we don't wait till we get to site to do that. We try and identify people that we want to work with kind of when we're doing some of our early sketching. I think we try and get our hands dirty a little bit. We sent probably about 10 of our team up to do the playscape a couple of months ago. We try and do engagement workshops with people, but I think, Ben, you're probably more skilled in doing that. So we try and leave that to the people with the techniques and skill to do that. And I think, I suppose for us sitting at a desk, it's more about learning how to do it so that we can enable it more than anything else.
So I guess, yeah, I've worked on standard construction sites as a kid, as a labourer for years. That's kind of all I did. But then in the conservation world, it's very, very different. So the craftspeople who work to repair historic buildings have a real voice. They get to talk to the architects. They get to kind of be included in design kind of conversations. They get to do kind of like not invent, but kind of like do unstandard things. They get to invent the plaster. They're not going to go to Jewson's and buy a bag of plaster. They're going to mix it on site to match the existing. And there's a real kind of like, I just kind of wish that kind of respect was brought through to a standard construction site, where the kind of the labourers and the tradespeople could kind of influence and talk to the design team as well. I think it would actually create a better atmosphere and a better build often. So I think, craft for us is very important. And kind of bringing that into kind of newer design projects. But how kind of, I guess I've always designed through making anyway. So I'm not the kind of designer who sits at a desk and designs. I'll be in our workshop making stuff. And that I find it works for me, but it doesn't work for everyone.
Can I just have a quick one? We just had Clayfest, and I wasn't part of the organising of it, but a couple of years ago we facilitated an away weekend for an engineering outfit called Momentum. They'd had no Earth experience prior to that, and so we just played with different materials and so on for the weekend. And then at Clayfest they spoke. They were part of the conference day, and I thought, what are they going to speak about? They really don't know anything about Earth. But obviously 2 years on, and the whole practice was there for that away weekend, they now do actually know something about it, and they are engaging with projects and saying, we could do this and we could do this. And it was the reality of them putting their hands in it that has changed the practice. So putting your hands in it is definitely the way to go. For me, then you can go back to the office and you can figure stuff out. But putting your hands in it is a really positive way to start.
One other thing, sorry.
Yeah.
As architects, I think the other thing that we do to get our hands dirty is model make. I think that skill and joy of doing that, I think, has been eroded over time, and we try and do that for every project. And I think COVID stopped that a little bit, but part of making 1:1 is you have to make it at 1:25 at 1:10 first, and making samples that you can in the office in that sort of sterile environment it helps us more than anything else before we can get the kind of craftspeople to make it.
There's a question on the front.
Even the question left my. Oh yeah, I have a question because we want to start working more with clay, with unfired clay, so I want to be able to answer this question actually. One thing, I grew up in Brazil. I'm from Brazil, and there clay and earth buildings, they are associated with first poor people, and one main thing when I grew up. I didn't see many clay houses around me. My dad grew up in one, but by the time that he was old, he was already gone. And one of the things was that clay houses were heavily associated with a disease called Chagas disease. I don't know if it's a common thing here, but I was wondering, first of all, if it is a worry here, and then more generally, if it's just because it is like a tropical disease. And more generally, maybe we talked a lot about the pros, but what are the main cons of having natural houses?
No, there's no Chagas here. But this association of poverty and ill health and all of these things is a global thing, and it's been very beautifully manufactured by a capitalist system of construction product and design of the last 100+ years. You'll find it absolutely everywhere. But we just had a very interesting little experience on the Tribeca site because the architect sneaked out some clay that we could make some blocks, and then we took the pictures of the blocks and we sent it to them and so on. And then the architect said, you know, in the block there's a frog, and it normally says the name of the manufacturer stamped in. Okay, he said, can you put the name of the project on that stamp? Okay, so we did that, and then we made a block, and it said Tribeca. And when that landed on the developer's desk, the job was sold. Right. So the whole game of all of this, the different clays, the auditing, the extraction, all of the rest of it, that's really, really the simple bit of it. It's the psychology to move away from how we've been painted as being substandard and, you know, not fit and all of these kinds of things. It's that psychology which really we're all playing with much more than the practicalities of how you actually do it, which are kind of quite straightforward in a lot of ways. So yeah, I think that's what I would say, and it's as much Brazil as here as anywhere else. It's the same. You hear the same thing over and over again.
To go abuse my role of chair and actually answer a question as well. One of the things that's really interesting is this perception that there are poor materials and expensive materials actually is prevalent everywhere. And one of these things is this kind of novelty of the new. You know, new things have more value, and this is going to be a whole shift as we start to do more retrofit of buildings. So, but it'll take a generation. You know, you talked about your dad being in those buildings. You hear these stories. Everybody else will have heard the same stories about that's a poor person's house, whatever that is. And it'll take a generation of us to say, actually, no, this is a great house. So we all have this kind of agency to sort of say, no, this is the kind of house I want to live in, or this is the kind of building I want to work in. So I would just, you know, it's interesting, but it takes a generation. I think, are there more questions coming up? Yeah, I think there's one isn't the pink? There you go. I'm getting the step count in today.
Hi, I've got a potter's question. We're always told about wiping up the dust with raw clay. How do you stabilise the surface when you're using raw clay in the plaster?
Cool. I think we've got 3 answers for you.
On the outside, we don't. On the outside, we let it erode. On the inside, actually all on the outside, you can use a material called casein, which is a dairy product which you can help to stabilise the surface. But even then, that doesn't completely stop it. So you have to either reapply it over time or just prepare to vacuum a bit more. But generally, the casein product just does stop it dusting internally.
Yeah, with internal casein we've used works really well. Also for internal plasters, flour paste. So just wheat flour, you cook it into a glue, like a really thick, kind of gluey, stodgy material, and add some of that to your top coat clay plaster, and that stops the dusting, it stops the friability. If you did want to go kind of more than that, I mean, kind of troweling it smooth will help rather than a textured surface. You can use a saponified beeswax called Punic wax, which is really good. That but that's quite glossy and will be good for a bathroom. There's also a product made by a company called Earthborn called Wool Glaze, which is very good, kind of very diluted. But I think really you don't need these products. The flour paste is amazing, and kind of just the skill of the plasterer itself will create a kind of dust-free environment.
And then when we've been building round chalk, and people really want to see the white, but chalk remains chalky at all times, which is particularly challenging to architects. Very often wear black.
It's navy.
So then we've also used sodium silicate and just sprayed on a very, very thin coat, so it doesn't change it goes on matte. It doesn't really change the colour, but it just stops that dusting, and really just up to sort of, you know, a couple of meters high. Above that, no one rubs against it anyway. So. Yeah.
I mean, the crucial thing is to keep it breathable. So you don't want to kind of stop that amazing breathability that these surfaces have. So you don't want PVA or modern paint or anything like that.
Go on, is it quick? Go on, of course it is. I'll let you. Okay.
That one was done with linseed oil. Linseed oil, yeah.
And we did it with wax, with a wax emulsion.
And you can do it with oil and wax.
You can also use pig's blood as well.
One for the vegans. I think what's really interesting here is actually that there is a kind of maintenance element, and I think this is what we've kind of lost. And actually, from a kind of social point of view, the maintenance is really important. It provides an ongoing kind of work stream for society, and I think this is one of the things we've sort of forgotten about. It's kind of build it and forget and run.
Maintenance-free is a myth.
Exactly.
Okay. People paint their buildings, they paint their horrible wooden frames that have just rotten under this horrible plastic paint. Maintenance is something that is just everywhere, but then they would just like to pretend that it's not, but it's nonsense.
Exactly. I think this is it. And you look at these glazed buildings all around London, they're all going to fall apart very soon. On that chipper note, we'll wrap it up there. But quickly, just to say thanks to Ben, Imad, and Rowland, who've been amazing.